This conference will now be recorded.
Very pleased to have Dr. Philippe Stroot, our consultant in biosafety from Xibiose in Belgium, joining us today. Dr. Philippe is no stranger to the Pakistan Biological Safety Association or to Pakistan. He has developed a number of workshops and given them on biosafety cabinets, institutional biosafety committees, as well as on now webinars on masks. He has worked with PEPSA since 2011. And we're very glad to have Dr. Mashal doing the main points, summary points. Dr. Mashal is a medical doctor, and she also has a master's in public health from Australia. So with that, please, I'd like to say one or two things. The chat room will be open for questions, and there will be a section for questions after each section in this presentation. So please go ahead and use the chat room for that. And now, with no further ado, thank you, Dr. Philippe, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ziba. Thank you, Dr. Mashal. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's my pleasure to present you this first session on issues related to mask and mask shortage. Actually, this session is really to bring a number of information about the risks related to coronavirus and the mask in order to facilitate the second session, which will be more based on questions and discussion. So what I plan to present you today is first some information about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID. Actually, I will focus on a few aspects which are interesting when we speak about masks. Then I will also present a second section on aerosols and aerosol transmission. Those who followed the training on biosafety cabinet already had part of that information. And then the last section of today will be on the face masks themselves, presenting the different types and also the way they work and what against what they protect. There will be at the end a very last slide about the topics for the next sessions. So this first part on SARS-CoV and COVID, what's the difference between the two? Actually, when we speak about COVID-19, we speak about the disease, the coronavirus disease, which arose in 2019. While when we speak about SARS-CoV-2, in that case, we speak about the virus that causes coronavirus disease. SARS means severe acute respiratory syndrome, and we already heard about that word a number of years ago when there was the first outbreak of SARS. So there are a number of different coronavirus infections. Actually, there are coronavirus strains which have been in with humans for quite a long time, and they are actually the cause of a common cold. So it's not a major medical issue, I would say. But then lately there are three different infections caused by some more virulent and more dangerous SARS coronaviruses. The first one was SARS-CoV, and it was an outbreak in Asia in 2002, 2003, and it finished in 2004. It started from China and Southeast Asia, but then expanded worldwide, but without really causing a pandemic. Then some years ago, in 2012, there was another outbreak in Middle East about caused by MERS coronavirus. This one is more dangerous. It creates a more severe disease. It's still in the air, so there are still people becoming sick with this infection, but it never expanded into a pandemic. And then the last one, the one which is causing the current pandemic. If we compare the two SARS coronavirus, so the one from now and the one from 2002 to 2004, there are a number of similarities. First, the genetic material is very much similar. So 79% of the genetic material is identical. There are also a number of similarities with respect to disease and epidemiology. First, the two viruses have a common origin. They come from bats with probably some intermediate mammals. They are both responsible for respiratory diseases, even if SARS-CoV-2 is also responsible for other symptoms. And they are both likely to lead to severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. And this disease, when it really develops, is likely to require oxygen supply, but also in some cases, artificial ventilation. Both viruses have a similar viability, so they survive more or less the same way, and resistance patterns. And finally, the two have the same high-risk groups, so mainly older people and people with a poor health status, mainly people who have some respiratory disease or circulatory disease, so with the blood system. So quite a lot of similarities, but so why the first one did not develop into a pandemic and this one does? Actually, there are a number of differences which can explain this. So the first coronavirus produced a more severe disease with higher mortality rates. It was around 10%, when in this case it's now more or less considered to 3%, but since we don't have a really serology of the population, it's probably much lower. So since the disease was most severe with high mortality, it was less easy for the virus to transmit. Each time someone dies because of the virus, it's a kind of end for the virus also, because you can take precautions with the body and so on. So it's in some way it limits its dissemination. Then the new coronavirus also seems to have a higher receptor affinity in human cells. So it is able to colonize human cells in a more efficient way. So it's more virulent. And colonization of cells starts with the nose and throat. Also, one point which is important is that it appears that there is some virus shedding before the onset of symptoms, like up to 24 hours before we see the first symptoms. And there is also the possibility of virus shedding in asymptomatic cases or very mild cases. That means that people who don't have any obvious symptoms of respiratory disease already disseminate the virus. Of course, this makes the prevention much more difficult. A third point is that the virus load in the nose and throat the highest load appears immediately after the onset of the symptoms, while it was much later with SARS coronavirus 1. Again, this makes it much more transmissible. When the symptoms are there, immediately there is already some transmission. Then the last point is that the symptoms are much more diverse in the second coronavirus. So it's less easy to recognize the virus. So some people, for instance, that have mostly some intestinal problems, something which doesn't have anything to do with respiratory disease. In that case, of course, it's much more difficult to identify COVID. So now about the viability of SARS coronavirus 2. As I said before, it's apparently more or less similar to the first coronavirus. And there has been already some studies on the second one. And for instance, one study shows that the virus is still present after more than 3 hours in aerosols, up to 70 hours on stainless steel or plastic, 24 hours on cardboard, and 4 hours on copper. This seems to be quite long. And if we think about the 70 hours on stainless steel and plastic, it's very long. Still, we must look at the way a virus disappears in nature. If you look at the graph on the bottom there, the one on the left-hand side, you see that we have the decrease of the virus with time. The x-axis is time, and this is the concentration of the virus. But it's a logarithmic scale. So this is 1, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 10, sorry. Oh, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. If we translate this logarithmic scale into a normal scale, you have a decrease of the virus like this. This means that the virus dies very quickly by itself during the first hours. And then after that, the decrease is more slowly. And you still have some virus present after quite a long time. But the quantity of the virus here can still be detected, but it's not likely to still cause infection, or much less likely. So most of the time where we can get infected is in the early phase of the virus. After that, it dies and the concentration gets lower, and we'll get to a point that it's not infectious anymore. Of course, it's a new virus and we don't have the infectious dose yet. The infectious dose is the quantity of virus which is sufficient to cause infection. That's the data that we still don't have. A good news about this coronavirus, it's first susceptibility to most physical and chemical factors is quite classical, and also it's a quite sensitive virus. It's not highly resistant, I would say. So the virus is sensitive to UV light, to heat, so autoclaving, for instance, is efficient, to desiccation. It's in aerosol droplets, but if the aerosol droplet dries, in that case, the virus will die. Sensitive to alcohol, 70% alcohol, and different types of solution or gel that contain at least 60% of alcohol, bleach, acetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, and also water and soap. This means that hand washing is a good way to get rid of the virus. And that, of course, is very important with respect to our own protection and to also to place barriers to dissemination. Washing hands is very, very important. So about the transmission of SARS coronavirus 2, clearly the transmission is done through airborne droplets, aerosols. I will explain a little bit more about that in a few minutes. From that information, that's something which is quite clear. There are three main transmission modes that appear more based on epidemiological evidence, the way different people get infected. And these are in order. The first one is direct or close contact. So people really live close together in the same household, like couples and so on, children and parents and so on. In that case, they have close contacts. That's the main mode of transmission. Then there is exposure to contaminated surface. Even if the virus spreads to airborne droplets, those droplets will finally hit some surfaces that will contaminate hands, desk, different objects and so on. And if we touch those objects, of course, we can then get infected, for instance, if we touch our nose or mouth and so on. This is why it's very important to wash hands. And the third transmission mode is real exposure to aerosol at a distance. So those aerosols are likely to stay in the air for quite a long time and travel during that time. And this is the third way of transmission. And I will explain a little bit more. Someone is not on mute there. Okay, so in direct relation with those three main transmission modes, the main prevention means are physical distance. So keeping some physical distance is very important. Depending on the country or region of the world, we speak about 1.5 meters or 2 meters. Then cleaning and disinfection. I told you that the coronavirus is sensitive to most disinfectant. Cleaning is also important because it's also sensitive to soap and water. And then the third prevention means, in addition to the other, is the wearing of masks. And that's what we'll explore further now. Of course, masks will depend about if we are really exposed to very high concentration of virus, high risk situation, or other situations. Okay. And I think it's time for questions, but Dr. Marshall will now summarize what I said in Urdu for your facility. So, Dr. Marshall?
So, yes. इस सेशन में हमने सबसे पहले देखा कि हमने कोविड-19 की डेफिनेशन देखी। कोविड-19 वो बीमारी है और उसका कॉजेटिव एजेंट SARS-CoV-2 है। सार्स वायरसेस पहले भी आई हुई हैं, उनको डिफरेंट नेम्स दिया था। सार्स जो पहले आई थी वो 2002 में 2004 तक थी, एशिया में आउटब्रेक हुआ था। फिर उसके बाद मर्स आई थी जो अभी तक कंटिन्यूड है, वो 2012 में। एंड अब 2019 दिसंबर में स्टार्ट हुआ है कोविड-19 एंड इसका पोटेंशियल एक पेंडेमिक पे पहुंच चुका है। इसकी पिछली वायरसेस से कुछ सिमिलैरिटीज थी। फॉर एग्जांपल ओरिजिन कॉमन हो सकता है, बैट्स पोटेंशियली बैट से ओरिजिन हुआ था। ये लोग कॉज करते हैं रेस्पिरेटरी सिम्टम्स एंड जो जिनको अटैक करते हैं, जो लोग ज्यादा वनरेबल हैं, इसमें भी वो सेम हाई रिस्क ग्रुप्स भी सेम है। फॉर एग्जांपल लोग जो बुढ़ापे में हों या फिर जिनके पास पहले से कोई बीमारियां और उनकी सेहत बिल्कुल ठीक ना हो। SARS-CoV-2 एंड जिसने कोविड-19 कॉज किया है, एंड पिछले SARS वायरसेस में कुछ डिफरेंसेस भी हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल कोविड-19 ज्यादा वेरिलेंट है, ह्यूमंस के सेल्स को ज्यादा स्ट्रांगली अटैक करती है। इसके अंदर ट्रांसमिशन भी हिडन है, लाइक वायरस शेडिंग सिम्टम्स शुरू होने से पहले स्टार्ट हो जाती है, इसलिए ये वायरस इतनी तेजी से फैल भी रही है। और इसके जो सिम्टम्स भी हैं वो भी ज्यादा वैरायटी पे हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल अपर रेस्पिरेटरी सिम्टम्स के अलावा डायरिया वगैरह के साथ भी ये प्रेजेंट कर सकती है। वायबिलिटी इसकी डिफरेंट सर्फेसेस पे डिफरेंट सर्फेस पे वो डिफरेंट अमाउंट ऑफ टाइम के लिए उसके ऊपर रहेगी। फॉर एग्जांपल एरोसल्स के अंदर वो 3 घंटों तक रह सकती है एरोसल फॉर्म में। अगर वो स्टेनलेस स्टील या प्लास्टिक के ऊपर हो तो वो 3 दिन तक रह सकती है और 72 आवर्स। कार्डबोर्ड वगैरह पे वो 24 आवर्स या 1 दिन तक रह सकती है एंड कॉपर पे वो 4 घंटों तक रह सकती है। लेकिन एक बात इस पे नोट करना बहुत जरूरी है कि जितनी देर वो एनवायरनमेंट में रहेगी उतनी उसकी पोटेंसी और कम होती जाएगी, यानी कि जितना रिस्क है उससे इन्फेक्ट होने का वो कम होता जाएगा। ये वायरस काफी सेंसिटिव है, विच इज गुड न्यूज। इसका मतलब ये है कि वो काफी चीजों से डिस्ट्रॉय हो सकती है। फॉर एग्जांपल यूवी लाइट से, हीट से, अल्कोहल अगर हम 70% यूज करें, ब्लीच, ऑक्सीजन पेरोक्साइड एंड इवन सोप एंड वाटर से, हैंड वॉशिंग से। इसके अंदर जनरल रिकमेंडेशंस यही हैं कि आप प्रॉपर फ्रिक्शन से अपने हाथ वॉश करें और 20 सेकेंड्स के लिए करें टू डिस्ट्रॉय द वायरस। ट्रांसमिशन जो कोविड-19 का है या SARS-CoV-2 का है, वो प्राइमरीली थ्रू एयरबोर्न ड्रॉपलेट्स हो रहा है या एरोसल्स। और इसके अंदर पे जो मोड्स होते हैं वो या तो आप डायरेक्ट कांटेक्ट या क्लोज कांटेक्ट। फॉर एग्जांपल आप किसी के साथ रहते हैं जिसको ये वायरस है। दूसरा ये है अगर आप किसी कंटामिनेटेड सरफेस को हाथ लगाएं और फिर उससे भी हो सकती है, और अपने मुंह पे या कहीं आप हाथ लगा दें। एंड तीसरा ये है कि अगर हवा में वो सस्पेंडेड रहे तो फिर रिमोट एट डिस्टेंस एक्सपोजर भी हो सकता है। इसलिए इन मोड्स ऑफ ट्रांजिशन को नजर में रखते हुए इसके प्रिवेंशन के 3 एस्पेक्ट्स हैं। एक ये कि आप फिजिकल डिस्टेंस रखें लोगों के दरमियान, दूसरा ये कि आप क्लीनिंग एंड डिसइंफेक्शन करें, एंड तीसरा ये कि आप मास्क पहने। इस सेशन में हम मास्क के ऊपर ज्यादा फोकस करेंगे। और अब अगर आपके कोई क्वेश्चंस हैं, डॉक्टर ज़ीबा। Dr. Ziba, will you do the Q&A now?
Okay, I will try to answer the question I see on the chat list. First, there is one participant who is asking about survival of the virus on fruits and vegetables. I would say that, to my knowledge, it has not been tested, but it's likely that the virus will survive sometime on food, on any type of food item. And also, one of the reasons for the virus to disappear is drying. If it's the case on some food, it will stay there for a while. But don't forget that that kind of curve where the dying of the virus is very steep at first, and then it slows down. So during the first hours, most of the virus gets inactivated, but still there is a risk of having some fruits and vegetables and so on contaminated and creating infection. So again, washing fruits and vegetables and so on is something which is very important with respect to protection.
Thank you, Philippe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my microphone was stuck. We have a question about whether or not the virus is aerosolized. He says medical procedures do produce aerosols, but coughing and sneezing also do. Do they produce aerosols or droplets? If you say aerosols, then it's much more dangerous. Even if the infected person coughs or sneezes and leaves the place, the other person can get infected within 3 hours. What do you think?
Okay, I think that this question might, I mean, the answer might appear during the next section, so I will not answer right now. If it's still there after that section, please ask again.
And there's another question about another virus along with COVID-19 causing almost the same symptoms with 95% similarity, and that it's speculated that this has been around since October. I think we don't want to be addressing this question on this particular topic. The other question is are there any studies on the viability of COVID-19 on surfaces of silver?
Not to my knowledge. But I think that with respect to surface, when we see the study that has already been done on that, there are quite a big difference between the different surfaces. And so we need to be very careful with this, because as long as it's not tested, all type of surfaces are likely to be contaminated. So that's why it's very important to disinfect surfaces. And it's true in a laboratory setting, in a hospital setting. It's also true in our normal life. And so disinfection is important, but also washing with soap.
Then the last question is Dettol useful?
Is what?
Dettol, D-E-T-T-O-L.
Yeah, Dettol is made of alcohol. I don't know exactly the percentage, but it's likely to be efficient. It is efficient against quite a lot of our microorganisms, including other viruses that are also sensitive to alcohol. So I would expect yes, but I don't know any specific study on this.
Okay. One question on the animal that was the main source of nCoV transmission.
Yeah, what we know is that there are many coronaviruses, including the two SARS coronavirus, which are present in bats. So we think that the original reservoir is bats. Still, there is quite a lot of discussion about the intermediate. So for SARS coronavirus 1, it could have been civets. In this case, we spoke about pangolin, but it's not so sure actually. So it's likely that between the bats and human, there has been some intermediate animals, but I would say it's not totally sure which one they are.
There's a question about transmission from animals to humans.
At the current day with SARS coronavirus 2, I don't know. It has been transmitted already from animals to humans. The question is probably more, can it be transmitted to animals that live close to us? There has been a few cases of infection in cats or even in a tiger in New York. So if it can be transmitted to cats, in that case, it could then go back. Cats could also infect people. But apparently, the few cases, first there are isolated cases, so it's not obvious that it's a good transmission. And also there are questions about, is it real or is it false positive or things like that. So it's not well established yet, but there could be a risk with some animals.
Another question about how we use paper in many stages, from the registration of a patient till the form is transported to the laboratory, can paper be a source from which you can get the virus?
Yes, paper can be a source, and there is no specific study yet, except the one I mentioned. They did some contamination and then measurements on cardboard, and the duration of the viability was quite low. But still, if, for instance, if a paper is recently contaminated, in that case, if you transmit that paper, someone could be contaminated with that. But I don't have the slide under my eyes, but it's a quite short survival. So paper, we could, if we need to get some paper out of the lab, for instance, we could let them there, and if we cannot decontaminate them, only get them out of the lab after some time. But paper could be a way.
So there's a couple more questions, but I think we need to go on. So can we go to the next section? We'll take some of these up later on.
Yeah, and also there are questions that we'll discuss on the second session, so next week. So yeah, okay, let's move to the next session. So this section is on aerosols and aerosol transmission. So first, what are aerosols? Actually, aerosols are liquid droplets, possibly solid particles that are suspended in the air. So that means that those droplets, particles, they are so fine that they can stay in the air for quite a long time. And actually, aerosols are present everywhere in the environment. For instance, the picture on the left-hand side is, you see some clouds there. Clouds are aerosols. They are made of liquid droplets that can stay there for a very long time, and they can move with the wind and so on. So this is typically an aerosol. The second picture is smoke. Smoke is also an aerosol, but mostly made of solid particles together with some chemical molecules. And then it's present in nature, but we also use aerosols for different purposes. For instance, if we need to administrate some drug to someone who has asthma and want the product to get into contact with the interior of the lungs, in that case, we create an aerosol to reach that. We can also use aerosols with some aerosol cans to spray. And also use aerosol to disseminate some molecules, for instance, in the atmosphere for some spraying, for instance, disinfectant and so on. Then all the aerosols are not infectious, of course. They are infectious when they contain some infectious agents. So most of the time in a lab, for instance, we use we use agents which are in a liquid solution, and in that case, if we mix those solutions, if we spill, in that case we create some liquid droplets and also some fine droplets that can stay in the air. And in that case, of course, those droplets can contain some biological agent. It's the case for coronavirus, but for most agents. Also, if, for instance, those small droplets dry out, that virus or naked bacteria that can also be make an aerosol. On this slide, you see the relationship between the size of the aerosol particles and the time taken so that the aerosol settles. And you see that for very big particles, they will drop very easily and they will settle very quickly in a few seconds. At the other end, if you see very small aerosol particles, in that case, they will stay in the air for quite a long time, more than 40 hours in this case. That means that they will stay there. That experiment was done in still air. But if there is some wind, if there are some airflows, in that case, those aerosol particles will move together with the air, and they might travel some distance. In most cases, when you generate an aerosol, you will have droplets of different sizes, and so that means that part of it will settle rapidly, and part of it will be able to stay in the air and then move depending on the airflows. So just remember that the largest one will settle very rapidly, and the smallest one are likely to stay for a very long time in the air. There was a question about coughing and sneezing as sources of aerosol. Actually, coughing and sneezing, there are reactions of our organism to get rid of some discomfort. If it's itching and so on, in that case, we will cough or sneeze to get rid of that discomfort. But it's also a very good way, and that was used by bacteria, by viruses, to spread and to disseminate in the air and to possibly infect other people. And you see that on the picture there that when coughing or sneezing like that, in that case, there is a kind of cloud made of aerosol droplets. The largest ones will settle very quickly, but the fine one will stay in the air for quite a long time. These are real aerosols that can really move through airflows. So coughing and sneezing is a very energetic source of aerosol dissemination. It's a very effective mode of dissemination also for the viruses and for the bacteria. Why? Because there are some fine droplets that will be able to move and to contaminate other people, objects, or infect some people. However, droplets and thus aerosols are also likely to be emitted when breathing, normally when exhaling, or breathing out, when talking, and so on. But in that case, in a much more limited number and with much less energy. So there will be less very fine droplets that will stay a very long time in the air. So coughing and sneezing, they are very high risk situation if someone is infected. Yes, I showed you this this picture to really think about how aerosols spread and what are the limitations. If we look at that graph, that picture, actually it's based on a model, and we see there that when coughing or sneezing, the big particles will settle very rapidly, while the smallest one will stay in the air for a longer time, and because of that, they will be able to reach longer distance. In this case, it shows, for instance, that the finest particles, they will stay in the air for 12 hours and move almost 50 meters. If you think about that, it's really frightening. We think, okay, someone is sneezing or coughing somewhere, and 50 meters away, there are still some aerosol which is potentially infectious and that could infect people. Of course, we need to be careful with this. In practice, it's not really the case. Why? First, because when someone is sneezing or coughing, there will be a cloud that is produced by sneezing or coughing, and that cloud will be very dense at the start, but then it will disseminate, and so there is a dilution. And so the particles that will be away, there will be only a very few particles. Most of the particles will spread in all directions. Also, remember about the viability of the virus. There is a quite steep viral decay. So the virus is inactivated by itself at first. So that means that, for instance, liquid droplets that stay in the air for 12 hours, most of the virus will have disappeared when it's settled. So clearly, the highest risk is very close to the person who is coughing or sneezing. The longer the distance, the less risk there is because of dilution and because of the natural inactivation of the virus. So again, this stresses on the importance of some physical distance, and of course we can add a barrier to that, and that's why we use masks. So clearly, aerosols are a major source of dissemination and transmission of SARS coronavirus 2, both in natural conditions, but also in healthcare and laboratory conditions. In natural conditions, if someone is infected and talks and so on, or even more if he's coughing or sneezing, but also in healthcare and laboratory conditions. In laboratory conditions, for instance, if you have some culture of or even some samples or some cultures of the virus, and you do some pipetting, you do some mixing and so on, there is a risk of aerosol. And of course, if there is a spill. In the healthcare setting, taking care of patient, for instance, if you have to remove the patient, which is laying on the back, and you want to be laying the other way, in that case, you have to handle it, and there will be an aerosol because that person is breathing. But it's even more the case if you have to do some intubation or if you have to remove a ventilator and so on. So there are clearly situations that are be considered as high-risk situation with respect to aerosol generation. And so there are different ways to try to control aerosols. The first, at the end of the slide, the first series of measures are related to containment. Biosafety cabinets. This is really those are devices that have been developed on purpose to control aerosols. Of course, we can use biosafety cabinets in most laboratory situations, but not for in a healthcare setting, for instance. In that case, you cannot work with a patient on a biosafety cabinet, of course. A second way to do it through containment is using a negative pressure and HEPA filtration. Okay. When such protection means are not available for different reasons, and for instance, in a healthcare setting, in that case, that's where we need to think about personal protective equipment, which is mainly done through the different type of masks that we can use. And that will be for the next session. So now it's time for questions again. So, Mashal.
तो जस्ट क्विक समरी इस सेक्शन की। इस सेक्शन में हमने एरोसोल्स को डिस्कस किया। हमने सबसे पहले देखा कि एरोसोल्स जो होते हैं वो क्या होते हैं, वो कोई भी लिक्विड या सॉलिड पार्टिकल्स हैं जो हवा में रह जाते हैं। इन्फेक्शियस एरोसोल्स वो होते हैं कि वो पार्टिकल्स जिसके अंदर कोई इन्फेक्शियस एजेंट प्रेजेंट हो। एरोसोल का जो साइज होता है उससे डायरेक्टली प्रोपोर्शनल होता है वो कितने दूर ट्रैवल करेगा और कितने देर वो हवा में रहेगा। जितना बड़ा एरोसोल होगा वो उतनी जल्दी सेटल कर जाएगा। हमने फिर देखा कि अगर आप कॉफ करें या स्नीज करें तो जो एरोसोल का वो होता है उसको एनर्जी मिल जाती है और वो ज्यादा दूर ट्रैवल कर सकता है। इसलिए कॉफिंग एंड स्नीजिंग से अगर इन्फेक्शियस जो एरोसोल्स होते हैं और एजेंट्स होते हैं वो ज्यादा जा सकते हैं और ये एक बहुत इफेक्टिव मोड ऑफ डिसेमिनेशन होता है। लेकिन इसमें ये भी नोट करना जरूरी होता है कि जितने दूर वो जाएगा और जितनी देर वो हवा में रहेगा उतनी उसका रिस्क कम होता जाएगा क्योंकि वो डाइल्यूट होता रहेगा और उसकी पोटेंसी कम होती जाएगी। फिर हमने देखा कि एरोसोल्स इसलिए एक मेजर सोर्स ऑफ डिसेमिनेशन है और वो दो सेटिंग्स में हो सकते हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल नेचुरल कंडीशंस में आप बाहर हैं, आपके घर पे आप घर पे हैं, कोई खांस वगैरह रहा हो, एंड दूसरा हेल्थ केयर या लेबोरेटरी कंडीशंस में। फॉर एग्जांपल अगर आपसे कुछ गिर जाए लेबोरेटरी के अंदर या फिर कोई हेल्थ प्रोसीजर करते हुए वेंट पे किसी को डालते हुए निकालते हुए उससे काफी एरोसोल जनरेशन होती है। इसको नजर में रखते हुए हमने कहा कि हम इनको कंट्रोल किस तरह कर सकते हैं। कंट्रोल करने के बेसिकली टू मैकेनिज्म्स हैं। एक ये कि आप पर्सनल प्रोटेक्टिव इक्विपमेंट की तरह के थ्रू करें, फॉर एग्जांपल डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ मास्क जो हम आगे डिस्कस करेंगे। दूसरा है कि आप उसको कंटेन करें, वो हो सकता है बायोसेफ्टी कैबिनेट्स के थ्रू, बट ऑब्वियसली हेल्थ केयर सेटिंग्स में ये इतना वायबल ऑप्शन नहीं है। एंड दूसरा हो सकता है आप नेगेटिव प्रेशर या हेपा फिल्ट्रेशन के थ्रू कर सकते हैं। लेकिन मोस्ट कॉमनली जो पाकिस्तान में हम जिस तरीके से कर सकेंगे वो होगा पर्सनल प्रोटेक्टिव इक्विपमेंट एंड मास्क, जिसको हम आगे डिस्कस करेंगे। अब डॉक्टर ज़ीबा आपके क्वेश्चंस लेंगी।
So thank you very much. There have been several questions. I don't think they're exactly related to what we have just heard. So let's go on with the masks because we only have 20 minutes left. We'll see how much time there is at the end. Please carry on, Dr. Philippe.
Yes, actually, I see just one question which is related to the former session, but it was asked privately, but I can still answer. The question is, according to some survey, the size of COVID is heavier than other viruses. Is there still the possibility to transmit via droplets? And clearly, yes, because the size of the virus is very close to the size of the influenza virus, which is also transmitted through droplets. And clearly, the size of the virus, even if it's a heavy virus, it's nothing when compared to even the fine droplets, and much bigger and heavier bacteria are also transmissible by droplets. So clearly, there is no doubt about that. Even if it's heavier than some others, it is transmitted via droplets. Okay, yeah. So this third session is about face mask. So the purpose is to present the different types of masks. We start with the mask that most of us know quite well, N95. But as you see on this picture, there are different other types of masks. I will explain a little bit more about that. Then surgical masks, which we also hear quite a lot about it. And then a cloth mask that can be either homemade, do it yourself, or manufactured. And then there will be a last slide about other masks and respirators. So, respiratory face masks, they are clearly designed to protect the wearer from aerosol particles and droplets. It's clearly their purpose, they are made for that, and they are tested for that. So you see that there are different different models of masks. And put there some picture. They can be molded, like the one on the very on the left-hand side, like this one also is molded. There are some others who have different structure. There can be without a valve, like the three on the left-hand side, or with a valve, like the three on the right-hand side. I will explain a little bit more about those valves later. And so also the structure of the mask, the composition of the mask, the materials they are made of can be very different. There are some with cellulose, some other without cellulose, and so on. So very different models. And that, of course, has an implication with respect to disinfection. In some will be easier to disinfect than some others. Also, some will be more easily damaged by some treatments, while some other will be more resistant. But we'll come back on that during next time we talk. What they have in common is that they need to reach some performance which are fixed by some standards and also tested according to those standards. On these slides, I put a number of standards, the ones that you are the most likely to find on masks related to masks that are sold in Pakistan. So those standards specify the minimum efficiency level of those different masks. And you see on the left, the American standards, European standards, Chinese standards. So in the US, the standard defines what is 995 or N99. So N95 has at least 95% efficacy, and N99 at least 99% efficacy. If you look in Europe, we speak about FFP2 or FFP3. It's about the same level of protection. And in China, KN95, KN99 are about the same. I say about the same because the standards are not identical. Sometimes there are different parameters which are used, and also the testing methods are not always the same. Just below the table you see, I mentioned also R95 and P95. Those masks, they have the same level of protection against aerosols as N95, but they are also resistant to oil for the first one and oil-proof for the second one, meaning that even if you have projection of oil and so on, it will not penetrate the mask. Okay. The ones that are most generally recommended for high-risk situation in hospitals and medical laboratories are clearly N95 and N99 or FFP2 and FFP3. So that's what is generally recommended for laboratory workers which are exposed to aerosols, or hospital and health care staff which could be exposed to high-risk situation with respect to aerosols. One thing about the efficacy of respiratory face mask, actually you can only reach performance which are close to the tested performance only if the masks are worn properly and also if they are well adjusted to the face. So the fitting of the mask is very important. So in relation to this, it's important to choose a suitable model and also for large institutions and so on, or you might want to have different models if this is possible, just because not everybody has the same shape of face, I would say. Some basic training is also needed to at least to know how to put it on correctly, and also how to take it off correctly without risking to infect ourselves. And then the last one is fit testing. Fit testing is at least recommended when wearing such mask, and like in many American institutions, it's mandatory to have some fit testing. And this is something I want to point out, because fitting is not optimal and sometimes very poor in presence of a beard, for instance. And I know that in Pakistan, as in many Muslim countries, many men wear a beard. That means that their protection might be compromised because of that. And of course, it's not so obvious in Muslim countries to convince males not to wear a beard just because they need to wear a mask for some of their activities. So it can be an issue like in a country like yours. The second point I want to stress on is that valve that is present among some N95 and N99 masks. Actually, the purpose of that valve is to facilitate exhaling, so breathing out. It's much more comfortable from that point of view. Also, it reduces the moisture inside of the mask. If you work in a very hot environment, if you have a physical work exposed to dust and so on, in that case, you might be sweating, and the presence of the valve will make it more comfortable in that respect. However, that valve has a major drawback. It's that there is no filtration of the air which is exhaled by the wearers. It means that if the person who wears the mask is infected, in that case, the air that is breathing out will be infected and it will not be filtered. It will go through that valve. So that means clearly that there is no protection of the colleagues and patients if the wearer is infected. So two conclusions to this. The first one is that only respiratory masks without a valve offer two-way protection. Two-way protection meaning for the wearer, but also for the people who are around that person. And the second conclusion is that in the COVID context, valved masks should not be worn in healthcare setting. If a valve mask is worn in that case, and if the healthcare worker who is wearing that is infected, in that case, it will contribute to the dissemination of the virus. Surgical masks now, they are totally different. And actually, these are designed to arrest bodily liquids from the wearer. So they are not made to protect the wearer, but to protect the person who is in front of the wearer. It was mainly developed for surgical situations where, of course, we don't want the nurses and the surgeon and so on to have some of their plates infecting the patient. In general, they have 3 layers, and the filtering layer is inside two layers of fabric. There is no need for a tight face fit. Why? Because exhalation of the air is through mouth and nose, and as long as the mouth and nose are well covered, there is no risk not much risk of disseminating an aerosol. It will be stopped immediately. Also, in general, there is no safety rating. There are some standards, but it's not so strict, and it's not really a safety rating. And there is no claim protection of the person who wears the mask. As a consequence, surgical masks are not considered personal protective equipment, meaning, for instance, that in the industry or in a setting where there are some regulations that say that the employer must provide some personal protective equipment to the employees, in that case, they cannot be provided because they are not considered as personal protective equipment. In a COVID context, that means that it's mostly recommended for COVID patients, and should normally it's not recommended that that the healthcare people, laboratory people wear that for their own protection. That's the official recommendation. Still, I want to present you this kind of study. Actually, This comes from one of the first studies that was done on the comparison between a surgical mask with a 95 and 99 masks. And in that case, it was done before the COVID outbreak, but there are a few new studies that have been done in between. Actually, these studies, they do not, it's not a testing of the mask like we would do in a laboratory. It's more like a field study, like a clinical study, I would say. And in this study, 2,800 and more nurses from 7 US medical centers were divided in 2 groups, and each of the groups were assigned either a 995, N95, or a surgical mask. Okay. And the study was conducted during 4 years, and the way to measure the efficacy of the mask was to measure the incidence of flu disease. It can be extrapolated to SARS because the 2 viruses have very similar sizes. Anyway, if we look at the graph, we see that only 8.2% of the people were wearing N95 mask were infected by the flu virus, while 7.2 were protected. Sorry, were protected when wearing a surgical mask. So the difference between the two is not so much, and it's certainly not significant from a statistic point of view. So this tends to show that perhaps surgical mask also offers some protection, and it's probably the case. Is it a good protection or not? It's probably not the best protection. Indeed, we need to be very careful with this kind of studies, and it's also the case for the more recent ones that have been done. First, those people, those nurses, were wearing the mask at work, and not, of course, during their normal life. And so most of the people who got infected by flu were infected not at work, but during their normal life, from their family, from their contacts in society, and so on. So it does not really measure the exposure at work. So if we were only measuring the exposure at work, I guess that the difference between the 2 types of masks would probably be higher. A second factor that might also make us more cautious about that is that people were wearing a surgical mask because they kind of know that they are less protected. Perhaps at work they were taking more precautions and avoid more direct exposure. So there are a number of reasons which make this kind of study not totally. We still have questions about those studies. Still, I think that the difference is very low, and still I think that. We think that surgical masks, even if they are not made to protect the wearer, they still bring some significant personal protection. How much, that's something we don't know. I say this because in some cases we really don't have any N95 mask or anything like that. And in that case, it's certainly better to wear a good surgical mask than nothing. Third type of mask, the cloth masks, there are many different types. And of course, one reason for that is that there is no standard, there is no specification and no performance standard that exists. They can be homemade, but more and more are manufactured by different cloth industry. They don't have any defined or demonstrated protection. We cannot say that this mask protects at 75% and this other are 95%. We don't have any idea of that. There are huge differences in design, but also in the materials, and so obviously it's likely that there are major differences in the effective protection. If you look at the different pictures, the third one, the light blue one, you see this type of mask looks a little bit like a surgical mask. It's also 3-layer, but you see it's open for the moment, but you can put some filter inside. By many specialists consider that this type of mask is probably the most protective one because you can put some good type of fabric inside, or even some filtering paper and so on that you can remove when you have to replace it. So there is a trend to favor this type of mask. by some specialists, I would say. Then my last slide about other types of masks and respirators. The two on the left-hand side are half-face and full-face respirator. The main difference is that the full face also has a face shield, so the eyes are, the whole face is covered. They work with cartridges. There should be one here, it's not on for the moment. And of course, those cartridges, they might have different filters. So in general, those filters, those masks, those respirators are used to protect from a number of chemicals. But if you have HEPA filters among those filters, in that case, they will also protect from infectious aerosols. And in that case, the filter you need is P3. So in that case, they are also good for biological protection, I would say. The two on the right-hand side are what we call powered air purifying respirators, PAPR. This one is half face, the second one is full face. Those have been specifically designed for laboratory or biosafety, I would say, for laboratory activities or healthcare situations. The main feature is that it's ventilated actively, but there is a HEPA filter, and the HEPA filter will retain the aerosol particles. Actually, first, those type of masks are usually not worn in front of patients or even for laboratory activities. It's only for very high-risk laboratory activities that it can be worn when there is no other means. They are very comfortable, especially the PAPR masks. They are very comfortable, but they are expensive and also not readily available for most labs and hospitals in Pakistan. So we won't speak much more about this. We'll focus more on the other types of masks. And this was my last slide. So, Mashal.
तो इस प्रेजेंटेशन में हमने देखा डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ मास्क कौन से होते हैं। हमने देखा कि रेस्पिरेटर्स होते हैं N95 वगैरह जिनको हम कहते हैं, सर्जिकल मास्क हमारे पास अवेलेबल होते हैं, एंड क्लॉथ मास्क जो ये खुद मैन्युफैक्चर हुए होते हैं, अदर किस्म के रेस्पिरेटर्स भी। हमने बात की N95 के बारे में। ये डिफरेंट टाइप के होते हैं, ये आपके मुंह के साथ मोल्ड कर जाते हैं एंड जनरली ये सबसे ज्यादा प्रोटेक्शन प्रोवाइड करते हैं। इसके स्टैंडर्ड्स वगैरह डिफरेंट होते हैं। ऑल्दो स्टैंडर्ड्स की जब हम बात करते हैं तो हम देखते हैं, फॉर एग्जांपल N95 जो है उसके सेम इक्विवेलेंट अवेलेबल होगा यूरोप के अंदर, चाइना के अंदर, न्यूजीलैंड और ऑस्ट्रेलिया के अंदर डिफरेंट नाम से। इक्विवेलेंस कंप्लीटली सेम नहीं होती है, डिफरेंट टेस्टिंग मेथड्स होते हैं हर अपने उसके, लेकिन जनरली वो सेम लेवल ऑफ प्रोटेक्शन प्रोवाइड करते हैं। और हमने देखा कि हेल्थ केयर सेटिंग्स के अंदर N95 या N99 सबसे ज्यादा रिकमेंडेड है। हमने फिर देखा कि इनकी परफॉर्मेंस एंड फिटिंग किन चीज़ों से अफेक्ट हो सकती है। अगर हमने इस मास्क में प्रॉपर तरीके से काम करना है तो फिर ज़रूरी है कि इसको सही तरीके से पहना जाए और इसकी फिटिंग जो है आपके मुंह पे प्रॉपरली हुई हो। ये कुछ कंट्रीज में, फॉर एग्जांपल मुस्लिम कंट्रीज में जहाँ पे दाढ़ियों वगैरह का ज़्यादा रवाज है, उधर मसला हो सकता है कि वहाँ पे फिटिंग का इशू हो सकता है, जिसपे ओवरऑल मास्क की एफिकेसी कम हो जाती है। हमने फिर थोड़ी सी रेस्पिरेटर्स की बात की जिनके ऊपर वाल्व्स हैं। वाल्व्स का जो सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट फीचर जिस वजह से वहां पे उन्होंने रखा होता है वो कंफर्ट के लिए। जिस बंदे ने मास्क पहना वो बाहर सांस ले सके, लेकिन इसका एक नुकसान ये है कि इसके अंदर जो प्रोटेक्शन है सिर्फ वन वे होती है। फॉर एग्जांपल अगर आप बाहर सांस ले रहे हैं तो फिल्टर जो है वो बाहर की तरफ नहीं होता, इसके अंदर जो फिल्टर है वो सिर्फ वन वे है, इसलिए ये हेल्थ केयर सेटिंग्स के अंदर अवॉइड करने को कहा जा रहा है। हमने फिर सर्जिकल मास्क की बात की। सर्जिकल मास्क जनरली 3 लेयर्ड मास्क होते हैं, ये लूज फिटिंग होते हैं एंड उनको वैसे पीपी इस वजह से कंसिडर नहीं किया जाता, लेकिन ये पार्टिकल्स वगैरह कैप्चर कर सकते हैं, तो इसलिए कोविड पेशेंट्स के अंदर इन मास्क को हम रिकमेंड कर रहे हैं। फिर हमने थोड़ी सी एक स्टडी डिस्कस की। स्टडी के अंदर हमने देखा था कि एक ग्रुप ऑफ नर्सेस था जिनको N95 मिला था और एक था जिनको सर्जिकल मास्क मिला था, और उन दोनों में डिफरेंसेस जब आए थे रेट ऑफ इन्फेक्शन के, वो बहुत 1% का सिर्फ डिफरेंस था, जो स्टेटिस्टिकली सिग्निफिकेंट नहीं है। लेकिन इस स्टडी को हम जब भी सामने देखें, हमने ये जरूर देखना है कि और फैक्टर्स भी हो सकते हैं जिसने स्टडी को इन्फेक्ट किया हो। फॉर एग्जांपल वो इन्फेक्शन हॉस्पिटल से नहीं ले रहे थे, बाहर से उनको इन्फ्लुएंजा की इन्फेक्शन हो रही थी, या फिर जो लोगों ने सर्जिकल मास्क पहने हुए थे वो वैसे ज्यादा केयरफुल हो रहे थे हैंड वॉशिंग वगैरह और उसमें। लेकिन एट द सेम टाइम इन केसेस जहां पे N95 रेडिली अवेलेबल नहीं है, सर्जिकल मास्क पहनने का भी फायदा हो सकता है। फिर हमने देखा क्लॉथ मास्क के बारे में। क्लॉथ मास्क का सबसे बड़ा मसला ये है कि इसके अंदर कोई स्टैंडर्डाइजेशन नहीं है, लोग घर में भी बना सकते हैं, बाहर भी बना सकते हैं। अगर क्लॉथ मास्क को देखा जाए तो फिर हमने कहा था कि जो थर्ड फोटो में जो क्लॉथ मास्क है जिसके अंदर एक फिल्टर प्रेजेंट है, ये फिर भी कोई सिग्निफिकेंट प्रोटेक्शन प्रोवाइड कर सकता है। हमने फिर जो मास्क देखे वो थे रेस्पिरेटर्स, फॉर एग्जांपल पेपर्स या फिर फुल फेस रेस्पिरेटर्स। इनका ज्यादा हम डिस्कस नहीं करेंगे क्योंकि ये पाकिस्तान में रेडिली अवेलेबल नहीं है। इनका एक नुकसान ये होता है कि ये बहुत एक्सपेंसिव होते हैं, तो हम इनको ज्यादा डिस्कस नहीं करेंगे। अब हम आपके क्वेश्चंस की तरफ आ जाते हैं। डॉक्टर ज़ीबा, आप ये सेशन, विल यू मॉडरेट द सेशन?
Yes. There's been a huge number of questions, and I know that it's already 6 o'clock in the evening in Pakistan. For those of you who want to stay for a few minutes, we could take a couple of questions. Otherwise, we will pick these questions up when we do the session on it. I think we're going to change it to Tuesday of next week instead of Monday. And also, PEPSA will be putting this presentation up on their YouTube channel. So if any of your friends would like to attend, it would be much better if they heard the basic session before they come to the question and answer session. So Philippe, do you want to take any questions now? There are many of them.
Yeah, thank you very much for all those questions. I'm very pleased to see all those questions, and there are some very, very smart and interesting ones. So I propose that we indeed discuss that together next time. There is also one gentleman who proposed to send me to share some information. Of course, you can do that in the meantime. It can only feed the discussion for next time. Perhaps the only question I will answer right now is someone who is asking a question about the exhaling valve. Is it filtering or not? Clearly not, and that's the reason why those masks with a exhaling valve do not protect the surrounding, the people who are not wearing a mask. So clearly that exhaling valve is something which closes when we inhale, but which opens when we breathe out. So there is no filtration at that level. Okay. So I propose that we now have a look at the last slide, if it comes. Yeah, it's about the next session. So probably next Tuesday. So first, of course we'll take all the questions that have been asked now and try to manage to answer those questions. If you have other major questions that you want to ask, please send them to PEPSA office. So in that case, please send those questions to the PEPSA office at those two addresses there. Then the proposed topics for discussion, we try to sort the questions to put them into those different topics. That these are proposals, so we can always come with some other issues. But the main topic that we wanted to address is the shortage issue. So there is a lack of good protective masks. And so we'll look at the alternatives to N95 and similar masks. We'll also look at the possibility to reuse masks or possibly to use them longer than initially planned for this type of mask. We'll also discuss about mask contamination in order to be able to reuse them, and then also discuss about the interest and protection that we can gain from do-it-yourself or other cloth masks. Also, we can discuss about the management of mask use and supplies, for instance, in an organization, in a region, and so on, to be sure that the right mask go to the right persons. One aspect that we might discuss also is suboptimal quality of some masks and possible counterfeit masks. I mentioned that because we had some issues with that in Belgium and in Europe. Masks that were not that were similar to official masks with the markings and so on, and some reference to standards, but they were not protective or not protective enough. And of course, any other questions you would have related to masks, please feel free to send them and to ask them. Any comments, suggestions about this?
Mashal, are you going to go ahead and translate?
Yes, I was just waiting if there were any questions. तो thank you everyone, आपने आज का सेशन लिया. अगला सेशन हमारा होगा ट्यूसडे को. अगर आप किसी को जानते हैं जिन्होंने ये सेशन अटेंड नहीं किया और वो वाला सेशन करना चाहते हैं, उनको बोलें प्लीज ये वीडियो देख लें. ये हमारे यूट्यूब पे कुछ देर में अपलोड हो जाएगी. अगले सेशन में हम प्राइमरली आपके सारे क्वेश्चन एंड आंसर्स पे फोकस करेंगे. आप लोगों ने आज जो क्वेश्चंस किए हैं और जो आंसर नहीं हुए हम उनको देखेंगे. उसके अलावा हम थोड़े से और डिटेल में जाएंगे कि हम मास्क को रीयूज किस तरह कर सकते हैं, उसको डिकंटामिनेट और डिसइंफेक्ट किस तरह कर सकते हैं. और फिर हम थोड़ी सी डिस्कशन करेंगे काउंटरफिट मास्क में जो मार्केट में फेक मास्क अवेलेबल हैं उनको हम किस तरह प्रिवेंट कर सकते हैं और उनको यूज ना करें. अगर आपके पास कोई क्वेश्चंस हैं जो आपको लेट्स से कल या परसों ख्याल आता है, आप पहले से हमें ईमेल कर सकते हैं. फिलिप, कैन यू प्लीज गो बैक ऑन द लास्ट स्लाइड? ईमेल एड्रेस इस वक्त आपकी स्क्रीन पे होगा. मुझे या आप शुरोज को ईमेल कर दें अपने जोन से भी क्वेश्चंस हैं ताकि हम पहले उनको प्रिपेयर करते हैं, अगले सेशन में हम उनको भी डिस्कस कर सकेंगे. थैंक यू अगेन सब अटेंड करने के लिए एंड मेरी तरफ से खुदाफिज.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your staying on even late into the day, and we look forward to your additional questions and to another session Tuesday at the same time, 5 p.m. Pakistan time. And that's all for now. Thank you, Dr. Philippe. Thank you, Dr. Michal. Khudafis.
Thank you, everyone, for your participation.